the average person has how many sick days? 8 to 10?
Not enough.
Not enough. No. Not to do a clinical trial.
If you have a chronic illness.
Yeah.
Right. So
Especially
you don't
if you
have
say-
enough sick
Yes.
days, but yet I want you to be in my trial and come once a month or twice a month. How is that? And you need your sick days maybe for your children or for your spouse.
But even for being sick, because
Right,
those
for-
sick days are
right,
just
right.
two
Or for your
that.
operation when you have
Yes.
Crohn's disease.
Exactly.
Yes.
But
Right?
yet, so that's where we have now, and I'm going to describe it, decentralized clinical trials.
Yes.
Where we have trials that come to you. So just like you have home health. So we have situations now where we're being able to bring the trial to the patient. They've had setups where the patient can meet, like I'm at work and I can take my lunch break and go get my blood drawn next door at the hotel. Like they
that's
have,
really
like they're
cool.
really,
Yes.
people are stepping the game up. And that's what's gonna have to happen because people can't take off work to go be in our trials.
Yeah. Ay, coming in. Yeah. Flex. I just wanna win. Yeah. LABB, who we running with? Yeah. 2233, I'm on 10 again. Yeah. Station.
Welcome to Coming in Hot, where we discuss health opinions and truths in the context of community and culture. Today's episode is titled Respect the Technique. We're about to get into research, and I know that's pretty broad, but basically we're going to be talking about what it is and why. Before we actually dive in, I'm going to pass the mic to my guest. Karen, you're up next.
Oh, thank you. I'm so glad to be here. My name is Karen Correa. And I'm the head of global clinical operations at Takeda Pharmaceuticals.
Hi, Mark Osterman. It's an honor to be here. It's my first podcast ever. So I'm the Vice President and Disease Area Head of Gastroenterology, Immunology, and Research and Development at Bristol Myers Squibb.
Awesome.
Hey everyone, Matthew McCurdy. Co-founder and newly appointed executive director of Black Health. Happy to be here.
And
Co-host of the podcast.
congratulations.
Thank you.
So
Credentials.
yeah, listen, you better put all those check marks next to your name, okay? Put some respect on it.
Now, did she rope you into it?
No, I volunteered.
Okay.
I love to be here. Anything for Mel.
Awesome.
Anything. See, you know what? Anything for Mel. That is a motto. More people should have that. I love that. I love that for you, and especially I love that for me. Yeah. In the interest of remaining health literate, Mark and Karen, you all have a lot of titles behind those names that are above my pay grade, and I know that pharma talks in a lot of alphabets, so we want to make sure that we remain patient friendly. So as we're having this conversation, I might pause or stop you all so that we can get a better understanding and that our audience can get a better understanding of terminologies. And we do that a lot here so that if we don't understand something, they may not understand something and we remain clear.
Understand.
All right,
cool.
So let's get moving. To kick things off, Matt, I'd actually like to ask you to explain what research actually is. What does it mean?
Yeah, and Mark, Karen, please feel free to chime in here after I'm finished. But, you know, when we traditionally think about research, I think most people think about going to the library, looking online, trying to find something or find information about something. But what we're actually talking about right now is clinical research, right? And so this is the opportunity to build something new, whether it's a therapeutic, so medicine, or a device, or even a new process. Right. And when you have clinical trials or clinical research, what you do have is people who are volunteering to be a part of that process. Right.
Pause, Matt.
Yep.
Therapeutics, what is that?
So therapeutics will be your medicines. Right. So things that you take to get better, to treat a disease, reduce symptoms, or even to be well. So great question. So as I was saying, when you think about research, specifically clinical research, you're also thinking about human subjects or people, right? So people are being a part of that process to test the safety and efficacy, or if the successfulness of that drug to ensure that it'll work. And that's the main way. You want me to say efficacy again?
Efficacy.
So efficacy is also going to be either the effectiveness or whether simply, does this work? Does it get to its intended purpose? And so that's the main way that we get innovation in healthcare, right? It's through clinical trials, through this clinical research process. And I think it's really instrumental that we have diversity in those trials. And I know we'll get back to that later in the conversation. But yeah, I think broadly, that is the definition of clinical research, and open to any additions that you all may have to that.
So can I ask a question? If I read a document and it says this product has 30% efficacy, so since we've now brought the word efficacy into the conversation, what is it saying to me if it says 30% efficacy?
Well, it can mean one of two things. It can mean it's either 30% better than the placebo, which is the group who got something which wasn't a medicine, whether it's like a saline solution or a pill that's like a sugar pill.
Look at you putting us on. You gave us a definition before I had to say pause mark.
See? Okay, good.
So placebo is what?
A placebo is it's a non-medicine, but it's a safe substance. So whether it's like a salt solution, if it's in like an IV or an injection medicine that you're testing, or if it's like a sugar pill or something else, which is like completely innocuous that you take. So 30% efficacy could mean that it's absolutely 30% of the people are getting better, or it could mean, or what we usually do is we test it against a control, which is a placebo. And if we say it's 30% better than that, because with some diseases, there will be a placebo response where patients will respond to just being in a clinical trial because they're being monitored. Maybe they're taking their other background medicines more regularly, so that it's not zero for a lot of diseases.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
I know we kind of got ahead of ourselves, but I wanted to dive a little bit deeper just because we were explaining research. Mark, since we're already on you, can you actually give us a bit more information about your background? What actually led you to the role that you're in, and what do you actually do in your role?
Yeah, so I was a inflammatory bowel disease doctor and researcher, a clinical researcher at the University of Pennsylvania for over 15 years. And just a little over 2 years ago, I left to go to do research full-time at Bristol Myers Squibb. And the reason I left, it wasn't because I was burned out by being a doctor or I wanted something new. It was because I just wanted to devote the rest of my life to fixing the millions of people with the disease, not just my 1,200 patients. So I was really wanted to understand the science of disease, understand how the disease behaves differently in different people, which is why diversity matters, because we're not the same genetically or in many other ways. And also, because of that, medicines work differently in different people, and people respond to medicines differently. And I think it's really important to understand the problem before you can try to understand how to tackle the problem with the right medications.
Karen, can you share with us about your current role and what you do and what actually led you there?
Awesome. Thank you so much. So basically, let me just talk about how I got here, because I think this is really important. A lot of times people know what they want to do when they're growing up, and I just knew that I was going to be a doctor. And when that didn't work out, I was like, what am I going to do now?
You made the right choice.
I made the right choice. I'm glad to know that. So I had the opportunity to get into research. I started out in lab bench doing research in a lab, and I realized real quickly that was not for me, that I did not want to sit there every day and do the same experiment over and over. So then I had the opportunity to go into clinical trials, as you mentioned, with patients and seeing patients and helping them, and then just growing up in the industry. So I'm super excited now to be.
So lab bench, I've never heard that term before.
Yeah. So, you see someone with test tubes doing experiments in a lab, one test, this test, how does it work?
A little microscope as well.
Microscope,
Wow.
looking it out. I did that for like 1 year, and every day I was looking for a job. I was like,
this ain't it.
This is not it. It's good, and it has a purpose, but it's not for me. So I had the opportunity to move into the industry and grow up. And so now, being in a pharmaceutical industry, I'm on the other side of the table and being able to impact clinical trials. And as you mentioned, I'm so glad you teed up my role. So that, like we talked about, drugs being developed, and then we develop them in a lab, and we say, okay, we think this drug is going to help something with someone with Crohn's or whatever. But now we need to take that drug and put it into patients. And that's the part where I jump in. So as soon as a drug is now going into patients, that's when my department is overseeing those clinical trials. We oversee those studies to make sure that those drugs are safe, that they're efficacious, as we just learned.
Yes.
Yes.
Vocab.
And so we can then move them along the process of phase 1 to phase 2. So there's different phases in clinical trials because when you start off, you give it to a few people, and then you give it to a few more people, and then you give it to more people, and then that's when you and then you do the submissions and all of that. So it's the different stages that you go through.
It's so important that we understand the process of medicine. As patients and just as consumers, we don't think about those processes. We're just like, okay, now the medicine is being prescribed to us, or we're going to pharmaceuticals, or we're going to the grocery store or to the drugstore, and we're picking up what we need. But when we hear about something that's being developed, our minds don't process that it went through an entire process. It went through investigation, really, and development to get to where it can be produced for us to actually go and buy it.
I mean, it can take more than a decade.
Yes,
We're trying to speed that up
Yes.
to help more patients more quickly, but it can take, I mean, traditionally back in the older days, it would take like 16 years from zero to when it's done.
Right.
And I think one thing a lot of people don't know and don't keep in mind is that safety is so important with these things, and safety is such a huge priority. In fact, like as a doctor, you know, one of the first things you learn in medical school is the Hippocratic Oath, which is a Greek physician, Hippocrates, and who sort of developed really the first code of ethics for being a doctor. And the first rule is really do no harm.
Yep.
So our medicines, pharmaceutical companies test them very, very, very carefully for safety, but also the health authorities like the the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, the one in Europe, the EMA, they're very, very, very focused on safety and efficacy, but safety is an enormous priority for them, and it's a huge consideration anytime we develop a drug that it's safe.
Agree.
Yeah, Mark, and Karen as well. You know, we know that clinical trial diversity is a huge issue, right? We know that Black people make up about 30% of the population, white people about 60%, but white people then make up almost 90% of clinical trial participants. So we'd love to hear how you all are thinking about
what percentage?
about 90%, right? And so if we had true equity, given what the census says, we would see representation equal to the population in clinical trials. So I'd really be interested to hear how you all are thinking about diversity in research, and the approaches that you all are taking to ensure diverse representation.
So this is a very amazing topic. My master's and my PhD dissertation was this topic. And so as you can see this over the 20 plus years in working in it, the way we approached it in the past is a little bit different than the way we approach it now.
Right.
In the past, it was more of a nice to have, something extra that a pharmaceutical company would do. But now with the new laws and the new regulations and new guidances from the FDA, we are now taking a little bit more of a stance, and we understand we now have to have a diversity plan.
Right.
And so within that diversity plan, as pharmaceutical companies or any other organization, biotech companies, we are putting actions in place to recruit patients of diverse backgrounds. There's so many avenues that you can do. One, and first and foremost, is to have the sites that have diversity patients. And so it's not just about the diverse staff, because people say, well, we have a minority investigator, you can have minority patients. That is a start, that's a help, but it could be just the environment. That could be an institution that's in that environment. And then you want to have a diversity plan and be able to target patients of diverse backgrounds with things that work for that patient. I tell people what works for one community does not work for the other community. So you have to have those grassroots efforts that you're able to reach them and to understand for them and have education for them so they can understand what a clinical trial is. A lot of times people think it's trust within our communities because of the things that happened in the past. And we won't talk about those things, but there's things that happened in the past that people think that's why there's trust in the community with, but actually it's not. People have a lack of trust with the healthcare they get today, not what they saw on some news or something they read 20 years ago. What is about, how are they being treated today in their healthcare system?
Can you just, the church wants you to repeat that one more time?
I was going to say, I was about to.
They have an issue with where? Not Henrietta.
No.
Not Tuskegee. They have an issue with who?
Today.
Okay.
Today. And so if the healthcare system can understand that today, we want to make sure that patients are being treated the same. They would be able to have some trust within the community to be able to do a clinical trial. No, absolutely. Listen to them. When they're telling you something's wrong, listen to them and understand what presents for one patient presents differently. And I'm so glad that you mentioned that, You know, you talk about it. The symptoms don't look the same. We're not textbooks.
Yes.
We present
Yes.
differently.
So-
I had the opportunity to speak at a community church in when I was in California, and we were talking about something. And one lady said, "I just don't get. What do you mean it's different?" I said, "How many of you women went natural?" It was a black church, and there are a lot of people raise their hand. I said, "How many of you can use the same product?" And everybody's like, "Oh, exactly.
Yes.
All of you can have curly hair, and
Yes.
all of you need different products."
Yes.
So if you need different products for just your hair, do not think that you can use the same product.
Yes.
That's just something as simple as hair.
Yes.
Yeah,
So when I
that makes a lot of sense.
So I try to make it
Yes.
simple.
Yeah.
Yes, and we listen. Hair is one of the things.
Hair is critical.
It's critical in our community. That's the easiest thing that we can relate to. Like yes. And how many brands are now out for Black women in our hair?
In our hair, right? So we want to make sure that people understand that we want it to be safe.
Yes.
So
Yes.
it is something that you have to do. You have to have grassroots. You got to work in the community. You got to work at the investigative site. You've got to have just the tools. I mean, if you see a brochure that's talking about clinical research and no one looks like you, are
Yeah.
you even going to be thinking about it?
Right.
Exactly.
You know, and then you got to think about every community needs different services. Do I need some type of service where I need car service? You
Right.
know, and you know how we give some type of incentive for the patient,
Yeah.
reimbursement.
Yes.
Don't give it to me at the end of the study. That's 2
Yes.
years from now.
Yes.
I need my incentive as I go
Yes.
along. Do you
Yes.
get paid today or do you get paid
Yes.
2 years from now?
Yes.
Right.
So it's thinking different.
We even take it a step further. We actually schedule for the patients. If we're
Yes.
supporting them,
Right.
we know that with our community, we know that sometimes they don't even have the ability to afford the opportunity. And people don't think about that. Sometimes just the entry into the opportunity, they can't access that.
Agreed.
That also prevents them from accessing the ability to commit to something that's supposed to open the door to them. And that's a barrier point. And no, they can't pay for the incidentals, the holding fee. They can't come to
Yes.
the hotel. They can't. So we set it up so that's not a barrier. And people aren't thinking forward. They're not 2 steps ahead. And they're like, oh, I didn't think about that, because you don't have to. You're not thinking about where there could be stops for people that are facing these kinds of tragedies and traumas in these communities.
Well, I know that our organizations, because I've seen what you guys are doing as well, we are also thinking about patients. The average person has how many sick days? 8 to 10?
Not enough.
Not enough.
No.
Not to do a clinical
Especially
trial.
if you have a chronic illness.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
Especially
you don't
sick.
have
Yes.
enough sick
Yes.
days, but yet I want you to be in my trial and come once a month or twice a month. How is that? And you need your sick days maybe for your children or for your spouse.
But even for being sick, because
Or
those
for-
sick days are
Right,
just
right.
two.
Or for your
that.
operation when you have
Yes.
Crohn's disease.
Exactly. But
Right?
yet, so that's where we have now, and I'm going to describe it, decentralized clinical trials.
Yes.
Where we have trials that come to you. So just like you have home health. So we have situations now where we're being able to bring the trial to the patient. They've had setups where the patient can meet, like I'm at work and I can take my lunch break and go get my blood drawn next door at the hotel. Like
Oh,
they
that's
have,
really
like they're
cool.
really,
Yes.
people are stepping the game up. And that's what's gonna have to happen because people can't take off work to go be in
Yeah.
our trials.
And some information can be collected electronically by patients
Yes.
themselves, not have to be going to the office to have the doctor and coordinator talk to the patient to collect the information when it's just asking historical questions. And when I was on the other side as a doctor treating patients who was enrolling patients in clinical trials, many patients would have reluctance. But one thing I would say is that the main incentive isn't what the company is going to pay you for the trial. The main incentive is to give science an opportunity to study this bad disease in someone just like you.
Yes.
So we can learn how it's different in patients like you and how our medicines work differently in patients to you, so we can figure out which medicines might be more appropriate for which patients. And some of that, relates to their genetic and racial and ethnic backgrounds. So,
That's a good point. That's a really good incentive to tell them.
But I think that that's an incentive from your perspective. It's not an incentive from the patient's perspective if they don't trust their provider.
right.
That's
Well,
100%.
and that's-
When they believe in their provider
Yeah,
and they know that you're riding with them, then they trust that. They believe in that. They find the value in that.
Yeah.
Like when Matthew and I, we do a lot of work together respectively in our organizations and then collectively together as a unit. That's why I'm always like, hey, Matthew, what are you doing today? I scheduled you for this. You didn't know. Like,
Yes.
Bless his heart that he's.
You want to fly to Philly tomorrow?
Sure.
Because I signed you up. That's.
I love flying.
Yeah, thank God that he's
So fun.
just is always like, okay, Melody. But we come face to face with a lot of students because we're on a college tour together, but
Yes.
a lot of just adults too, people, community members, and we get a lot of the same story. They trust us because we made it our business
Yes.
to be there with them, to be in community with them, to answer their questions, to talk to them, to listen to them, and they tell us a lot of stories. And hearing what they're saying, it's not, hey, I don't trust that healthcare can work for me. I don't trust what this person in the healthcare system did to me.
Yep.
So it's the representative in
Yes.
the space that has done this to me that makes me now not trust the system.
Well, I will say for sure, in my experience, the number one determinant of whether a patient will enroll in a clinical trial, even speaking to my colleagues and talking to my own patients and their other experiences, is the trust in their doctor.
Yes.
Yes.
And I just think that's always one of the most important parts of the doctor-patient
Yes.
relationship is
Yes.
the relationship, because you're not just like going to buy a product somewhere that
Right.
a machine makes. It's a relationship. So.
Yes.
Mark, I'd really like to dig down there. I know that, we talked about diversity in trials, but I would also love to hear how you thought about when you were a physician, building that trust with your diverse patients, and the steps and tools that you may have used to build that rapport and build that relationship.
Yeah, well, I think the main thing that I think was effective with patients was just me being myself and
Yep.
being real.
Yes.
And
Yes.
it wasn't like being real going wrong. It was just being real going right. And they appreciated that I was just down to earth. I told it like it was. I told them the truth, and I gave them my honest opinion, and it wasn't like biased by stuff. It was just what I thought was best for them. And they were like my friends and my family. And the hardest thing about leaving was leaving them, but I promised them and I would try to fix this thing for the world. And so, but I really think that the most important part of the relationship is just like you have a relationship with your friends. It's just the human, down to earth, unstrip the layers, be yourself, and get like real and raw with people. And I think that people always appreciate that. I always have with other people. So
Yeah.
yeah.
That's awesome.
And what I hear in that is that you take time, right?
Yeah, well, one of the most important things is actually listening.
Yeah.
I still think William Osler, who is one of the most famous physicians of all time, he invented the residency program for better and worse, for those of us that had to go through it. But he said that this was before CAT scans and all the fancy tests we have nowadays. But he said that 90% of your way to a diagnosis on a patient is just based on the history and physical exam, just by spending time with a patient.
Yes.
And while now we have much more sophisticated tools and we can find more things out than we could before, I have so many patients that would tell me that the main problem with their last doctor was that they didn't listen.
Yes.
Even more than that, they didn't know what they were doing, but they just
Yeah,
didn't
they
listen.
didn't
And a lot of people, like I order a pizza and they deliver the wrong number of pizzas or send the wrong address. Like, people just don't listen in the world much.
Right.
I mean, nobody listens. They always have their mind on something else. They're multitasking. But listening is the most important thing, because people will often tell you and guide you to what's wrong with them.
Yes.
You just have to listen and pick out the clues.
Listen to understand.
Yes.
And not to respond.
Yeah.
That's what I always tell people.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
I always didn't talk too much because I always learned more from listening than from talking.
Yep.
So,
That's awesome.
yeah.
One of the challenges we have with our community members when it comes to research is they're not being asked. So the physicians are aware of these studies, and we're trying to navigate as we're working together. We're going on these college tours that I mentioned earlier. Matthew does a really great job of explaining, because we feel like if we are educating college students about what clinical research is, we're sharing informed consent, we're sharing about IRB, so that we're not drilling in their head, as you mentioned earlier, Karen, about historical issues, medical mistrust, because Matthew and I both don't really subscribe to it's all medical mistrust. There is medical mistrust there, but how do we move past? We're always looking for solutions, and that's why we're even here to, and we're talking about this. What are the solutions? So we give them tools. There's a response for that. Like I always think about Apple saying, there's an app for that. When it first came out, we were looking at those commercials. So we say there's an answer for that.
Yes.
What would allow you to participate? What allows you to move forward? Because that's what we're here to do, to move things forward.
Right.
So we give them answers. when we think about the issues with physicians not sharing the trials and research opportunities, that's a huge impediment
It
to
is.
moving patients forward.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
I think some physicians might have some biases. I think we all have biases, first of all.
Yes.
Let me be very transparent. We all have biases, and sometimes we're still working through them. And when we recognize them, then we're able to start to address it. But some people are still carrying them. So there might be some biases, but I really think a lot of times investigative sites or physicians, they maybe went through all of those patients within their practice. And it's all of the untapped patients. So I'm on the board of a federally qualified health center. So we have 10 centers in South Jersey. I'm sure none of our patients are being asked to do clinical trials because we don't do clinical trials at our centers. So there's so many community hospitals and federally qualified health centers and so many centers that our marginalized and minority communities are going to, but they're not going to some of these academic centers on their
Yes.
daily, journeys
Yes.
of their healthcare. So they're not being asked because they're not a part of that system. And we don't really have a good connectivity points between the two. We're still working on it in the industry.
Right.
There's a lot of things that pharma's doing and other organizations are doing to try to bridge those gaps, but they're not there yet. And so
Right.
those types of situations is keeping certain communities out of the process of participating in clinical trials. But then again, we need more people at the table,
Right.
on our side of the table, that are minorities as well.
Right.
So, because if you're not at the table, you're on the agenda.
Ground.
So
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
we got to get more people.
Right.
So as you're talking to the college students, they got to see the career opportunities and
Yes.
the growth, and they're part of the process too
Yes,
that
for
we need to
sure.
work on.
And that's where the academic centers, the major hospitals, and the big teaching hospitals, and the larger community hospitals and centers that do a lot of clinical research, they can help a lot because they get referrals from the other community centers that don't do research.
Right.
And, I think they're a great resource to help also increase just the awareness of clinical trials, the importance, and have patients and consider it. And I wanted to go back to your point about the IRB, the institutional review boards of universities and of sites that do clinical research. It's another layer of safety. So I think
Yes.
what a lot of people really aren't aware of is that there are multiple layers in place to keep patients safe. So their
Yes.
own institution is worried about you getting harmed in a trial.
Yes.
The FDA is worried
Yes.
about it. Pharma's worried about it too. We don't want to
Yes.
hurt anybody.
Yes.
Like a lot of us are doctors that work there. The
Yes.
last thing we want to do is hurt somebody. We, those of us that left to help more people.
Yes.
So I think a lot of people just don't understand that and aren't aware that there's multiple layers of protection there
Yes.
to keep people safe and you're not experimenting on people. So,
Agree.
Yeah.
Good point.
So, Matthew, there's a stat, I'm not sure you were able to pull it, about the rising incident of IBD amongst communities of color. Do you have that information?
Yeah, I think broadly what we were seeing in the data is that over the last 30 years or so, we're seeing higher incidence of IBD in communities of color, specifically Black people, Hispanic people. That rise is increasing at a rate larger than the increase that we see among white people. And I think we're all trying to figure out why. Like, why is it a diet issue? My thought is that it's a social determinants of health issue. There are things happening in our communities, our access to healthcare, the exposures that we have in our communities that may be impacting that rise. But yeah, we are seeing a larger amount of people, specifically Black people, having IBD. Traditionally, 30 years ago, it was like, this is a majority white issue, right? White people are the people who are getting IBD. And that's why we see some of the late diagnoses, the late screening happening in our community, because it was traditionally thought as not a person of color problem. So yeah, it's been an issue that's rising, and I think it's part of the inspiration of why Coachy was started.
Right.
But I would love to hear more about how we think about disease presentation, specifically from you, Mark, and what we're seeing differently between our people of color and maybe our white people, and how that looks.
Well, I can tell you from my experience, I had an incredibly diverse population working at Penn in West Philly. So I had a lot of African American patients, but I also had a lot of East Asian patients and Southeast Asian patients, and Hispanic patients, and Jewish patients, and Middle Eastern patients, and non-Jewish Caucasian patients. So I had a great mix, which I've always loved diversity.
Right.
I think it's interesting and spices things up. You learn from I was always attracted to people who looked different from me because I would learn something new and experience something new through their families and their eyes, and their views on doctors were different. There was some, it was, sort of more taboo to take medicines and see doctors. Others put complete faith in their doctors. Also, with respect to medicines, some cultures prefer a more holistic approach or herbal medications, which have been practiced in East Asia for thousands of years and undoubtedly work. Right? So I think people have different perspectives. And then with diagnostic testing, some people really do feel like they're a pincushion and you're doing experiments on them. And I think some of their background and upbringing really ties into that. And I noticed the patients, who have a lower socioeconomic status and like a kind of a less supported home. Some of my young patients who had like no social support at home, they were the ones that were missing their appointments the most, the ones that weren't taking the medicines the most, because they just didn't have like mom or dad or a big sibling at home that believed in this stuff and sort of encouraged them and brought them up that way. And those are the patients that also often had the worst disease because their fistula got out of control and their whole anal area was like just rife with fistula. And then it was like, and then they needed an ostomy to save them essentially from their fistulizing disease. So a lot of things go into this other than just genetics.
Right.
I would agree. I mean, I think there's something that we're seeing is that people are also the underdiagnosed community. So we feel like, and I know a lot of other diseases, overseeing a lot of different types of therapeutic areas in my years, we've learned in a lot of diseases that that group was underdiagnosed in the beginning. So it wasn't maybe the prevalence and the incidence was going up. It was just they were underdiagnosed. So that was one of the gaps. And then I love what you're saying. It's the social determinants of health. We tell people all the time that health, people think of like the body, health is everything around it. It's the diet. It's the environment they live in. It's the emotional state that they're in. It's everything. That's how their health is. It's a whole piece. And if all of that is not lining up, that's going to impact the body. And so it's not just what you see. It's what they're touching, they're feeling, they're hearing, they're believing, they're eating. It's all of that. And that sometimes in certain homes, in certain environments, it's not conducive for the body to thrive.
Yeah, sometimes it's just not talked about very much, or it's not, or you're not allowed to talk about certain cultures. You don't talk about anything.
100%.
It's shameful.
100%.
My upbringing, there wasn't a lot of talking about this stuff. There was like a lot of working and doing.
Absolutely.
I had immigrant parents, and all my friends who were immigrants, their parents, it was the same way. It was, you don't talk about things, you don't talk about feelings, you just do. And you perform. And if you get a 98 on a test, it's why did you miss one? But certain cultures you don't talk about. There's so many social problems in the world because people weren't allowed to talk about it at home. I really think that's and health. Really, it's not the body. It's your life. It's your whole sphere of everything that determines often like how you're doing, and a lot of that stuff isn't really truly recognized.
Agreed.
It's kind of like the iceberg that you see. The picture with the iceberg. You see this part of the top, but it's all the stuff under.
Yes, it's what the Titanic didn't know.
Right. Yeah, it's all the stuff below that's like missing. And sometimes you just can't see all of that. And that's why I take my hat off to our physicians. Because they are seeing someone for 20, 30 minutes and they're trying to make such found decisions off that little bit of time when there's so much going on with that patient.
But over time, and as you get to know people and the people you work with know some of the people, they live in the same neighborhoods, and it's like, oh, she didn't come to clinic today. What's going on? It's like, oh, I'm going to go knock on her. Our nurse like, I'm going to go knock on her door and find out. So like you get to know people. You get to know, oh, they're not going to come. And you call them like, why didn't you come? But you can't know that the first time you meet them. But over time, it's like a friendship, and you know what they're up to and what they're not up to, and you can help sort of keep them out of trouble. You can look out for them.
For sure.
But all these things matter. And a lot of these things are non-medical.
They do.
They're all not like, all these things are largely non-medical.
So that's actually what brings me to my next question, because we're getting into this space where you mentioned decentralization earlier. And I think that is probably these are the most important aspects to Black and brown communities. especially with them participating in the research, the non-medical aspects of supporting them if they're participating in research,
Yes.
the non-medical aspects. What have been the steps that you all have recognized have been valuable in moving these communities forward in participating in research?
I mean, some of the things that I mentioned before, and that's truly being able to understand that the protocols that we develop, and we really do try. I know it may seem like we develop these very intensive protocols with all these inclusion, exclusion criteria and stuff. They're very complicated.
Yes.
But we have plans on trying to make them more simple, but then we get feedback from the regulatory authorities, as you mentioned, or there's, we have to have this.
Right. Compliance is something.
It's something. So it might complicate it more than we would like for it to be. But then we try to do everything we can to make it simple for the patient.
Yes.
So again, we try to minimize the number of visits that the patient have to make. We try to make them minimize the time that the patient has to be at the facility. We try to make like tools and call centers and so many things that we can do to improve that process. But it's a journey, so we have to train our investigators, which is our doctors, and we have to train their study coordinators, which is their nurse. We have to train all of these people and everybody that's in that community to help that patient thrive. And then we have lots of vendors that we use, patient advocacy vendors and patient recruitment vendors and all of these different people to be able to help support that patient on that. Just kind of like having a concierge service.
Yes,
we do have some organizations that provide that. Like I said, I've done trials where we pick the patient up, we get the patient to the facility, like all the things that you're talking about.
I love that too.
It's a lot. You have to think, but the other thing is, it's different for every patient. What one patient needs, another patient might need something completely different. And so it's about having that customization that sometimes is a little hard.
And part of the reason that trials are so complicated is because we're trying to understand multiple facets of the disease and more scientific things about the disease, especially to understand what makes people different from each other. So part of the complexity is because we're just trying to learn more. And this kind of environment where you have someone getting a medicine and someone not getting a medicine is sort of the ideal situation in which you can learn information in the sort of most valid way. So part of it's just because we're trying to learn more. So
we really are.
I often get asked, because I have a complicated illness, I do manage life with Crohn's disease, if I will refer our community members to trials that include placebo, and I don't. We haven't. I share what studies are out there, but knowing the challenges personally, I don't participate in those studies because I know how challenging it has been for our community members. If they choose to participate in them, that's their choice.
Right.
But as an organization, because we understand that it comes back on us, it falls on us. We haven't actively said, we share this and support it, because we have to always think about, if we share this particular study and there's a placebo there, it really will fall back on what the perception of our organization is from the patient. How do you manage the mindset of these patients when they're now having to determine, like, there's now placebo, I could potentially be on placebo, or I could actually be taking the drug. There's a lot of emotions that they're now having to manage, not knowing uncertainty.
Well, one thing, we're trying to increase the ratio of patients being randomized to getting drug versus placebo.
What is randomized?
Randomized, I was actually explaining. Randomized is when is randomly being assigned to one thing for another, but instead of 1-to-1, it could be 3-to-1 that get drug versus placebo. So we're trying to increase those ratios whenever we can. And then the reason we also need placebo is because our endpoints they're just not very good and specific. So
What's
I think
the endpoint?
if we had, so in a clinical trial, it's what you look for, like clinical remission, like patient doing well. And also we like to see that they're doing better on the scope too.
Yes.
But in the future, it would be nice if we had something even more objective, that you could only be better if this thing was working for you, and therefore you might not need a placebo.
Yes.
Right.
But, patients are always worried about getting placebo.
Yes.
But, for some patients, they're out of medicines. They've gone through every single thing we have, and the only way we could help them is there's a chance they might get the drug. And in clinical trials, one nice thing is after a the first initial period of the study,
Yes.
where we determine if you're doing better. After that, if patients aren't doing well enough, they can move into what's called the open label extension,
Yes.
open label trial,
Yes.
where they know they're just getting
The
drug.
drug.
Yes.
And then they're on the study, but they know
Yes.
they're getting drugs. So usually
Yes.
the window which they wouldn't be getting any drug potentially, can be minimized too.
Yes.
It can be like the first 12 weeks or something.
One of the things that we've made in our business about doing it coaching is not saying that clinical research is a last option. So you're saying like we never say it's a last resort or a last option, because a lot of physicians have said, well, this is all you have left.
Yep.
It's not all you have left, honestly, because there's always a steroid, right? There's always, which makes us crazy. For some of us, for me, it made me crazy. There's always that, but it is an option that actually could advance science. It could advance you. We tell them about the opportunities that clinical research has, because a lot of physicians really speak that, and it puts them in a very deteriorating mental state, because they're saying, well, you have nothing left and that's it. And I said, why do you speak that to someone's spirit who's navigating something that already feels detrimental?
Well, and also remember that some of the trials that are done, the drug actually works better than the stuff we have now.
It
So there's always a
does.
chance that
That's
this
why
new
there's
thing,
medication on the market.
It's gonna be
That's
really
why there's these
amazing.
new
like
medications.
in cancer, sometimes the medicine cures you, when
Right,
the other stuff didn't. So like
100%.
sometimes the trial is like the next new thing.
The
The
next
next
But guess
big
what?
thing.
Every medication we have on market was a trial.
Was a
Right.
trial.
So,
trial.
well, I want to say
I think that's
that research is fundamentally important, because without it, we wouldn't have the majority of our medicines that help people with some really terrible diseases.
Everything
So-
was a trial before. So
Right.
I always try to find the space for them to hear what I have to say. So I want to encourage even the physicians that are listening and the industry partners that are listening. When you speak to people, it's important to give them a space of hope, being honest with them, but sharing that there are other spaces of value to be able to give people information, and not to speak to a space that will further place someone in despair when they're navigating these illnesses.
I think that you have to think about the person's motives. I think everybody's motives is different.
Yes.
Some people do have an altruistic approach.
Yes.
So letting them know that they have an opportunity to bring to science,
Yes.
that might be really good for them.
Yes.
But there are people that might not work for them.
Yes.
That might be like, okay, but I don't want to be the one to do that.
Yes.
So you have to be honest. So I think it's
Yes.
also nice. I remember when I was a study coordinator and I used to consent patients, and I did pediatric trials in asthma analogy. I used to also tell, this is an opportunity for me or our physicians to learn more about you.
Yes.
Because trust me, I'm going to see you more often
Yes.
and for longer, and have
Yes.
more data about you and your
Yes.
disease in a clinical trial than in normal practice.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
That is true fact.
And you
so
have
when
above
another-
care. You have above quality of care.
And you get free medicine.
Right, and you're free
For a while.
So it
And-
gives an opportunity for that physician and
Yes.
that practice to learn more about that patient and their journey and whatever they are battling. And so there is a benefit in that respect,
Yes.
for to have that touch point. Because
Yes.
again, I'm just talking about like community hospitals. I can
Yes.
tell you that the physicians that are federally qualified health centers, they don't have time to spend
Yes.
hours and multiple visits with a patient. That's not how it works in normal
Yes.
practice. So I'd like to be
Yes.
very transparent.
Yes.
Some people, it takes months to get a visit.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
The
So-
standard of care is needs work.
It's tough.
It's tough.
It needs work.
tough.
It needs
It needs
work.
work.
And we need
It
more
needs work.
people.
And
And we need more
needs work.
doctors.
It needs
yeah,
workers.
Workers,
We need
yeah.
workers.
Work
Needs
and
work and
workers.
We need
workers.
workers, doctors.
We need everything.
We need everything.
So when you get the opportunity to participate in research and trials, you do get a lot more attention
Yes.
Yeah.
That
and
you can-
access.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
And a lot of that's paid for. And like, for instance, in some countries where they have like almost no access to care,
Yes.
they
Yes.
can get free drug for 5 to 7 years sometimes,
Yes.
which is, and they get better. So it is providing a value to the patient in a lot of different ways.
Agree.
And if it no longer works and you're not feeling well or feeling like you
Stop.
can continue your participation, you can stop.
Or if you just decide, I don't want to do this anymore.
Yes.
Even if you're feeling good,
Yes.
like you can
and
just
that's
stop.
where this informed consent, where
And I think that's an important piece because people don't
Yes.
realize, am I tied in this forever?
yes,
No,
No.
if you really truly feel like this
Yes.
is not for you, you can, just
Opt out.
continue. You can opt out
Yes.
as long as you give. We do like for people to continue to keep the follow-up process, even if it's just a phone call, so that we want to know how you're doing. Because
yes,
loss to follow-up is not good for our data. So
Yes.
we want to make sure the data is well. We want to make sure we understand what happened to you along the way.
Yes.
But you can opt out. We don't want
Yes.
no one to feel like that this is you're in, and this is it. You can't do anything else.
Yep.
Yeah,
You
that's
know?
And part of that follow-up data is for safety, to make
Yes.
sure the medicine's safe
Exactly.
long
That's
term.
what yep. The safety of
Yes.
And that it works, but
It's not a gang. You're not getting jumped in.
right.
Yeah.
You're not. Yeah.
Yeah, that agency is really important. We really emphasize that on
Yes.
our college tours. I think people feel that they get into a trial and it's like, I got to be in here forever.
Forever.
Yes.
Yes.
And even when their relationship with their provider, right? We want to make sure that people know they have agency. You can fire your physician if they're not doing what they need. You can leave a clinical trial.
You sure
And I think people don't really realize that those trials are not going to be successful without you as the patient, without you as the person. And it's really the patients have a lot of power in that relationship.
Yes.
And we really try to empower people to know that when they're deciding to whether or not to be a part of a clinical trial.
yeah, I mean, choice is a huge thing. So
Yeah.
none of this stuff is like coerced or,
No.
it's all voluntary. And, you also want people who are engaged and who want to do it, because they're more
Yes.
likely to follow up
Yes.
with
To
a
follow
child, and they're more likely to give you good information because
Right.
they're taking their stuff, they're coming to see you, they're doing their
completing
tests. Like,
diaries.
you're
Yes.
going to get a complete set of information.
Yes.
And if you get enough patients with a complete set of information, then you can decide if the thing's working and
Exactly.
how
Yes.
it's working best.
You can
But I
pick-
think at this time with social media and all the social platforms, when they are engaged, when they do want to participate and they're excited about it, they're going to be vocal about it.
Yes.
They're going to share, they're going to announce, they're going to be the marketing for this opportunity. And they're going to say, you should participate in this opportunity because I did this and I learned this. And here's what the data says. I've seen it, these different studies. And I'm like, oh, wow, let me go look this up. And people have caused me to want to investigate or learn more about a
Yes.
particular study because they're bringing awareness to it because they're excited about what they've learned or gained from their participation.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I think one last question before we wrap. In that same vein, thinking about how people find out about clinical trials. We know typically Black and brown people do not have the same access to physicians. We know that the physician is mainly the entry point to a clinical trial. Have we thought about other ways to get people engaged in clinical trials? I think you mentioned community partners and things like that. What are the other avenues that people can explore to find out more about trial opportunities?
Well, the first and foremost, one of the you just say for nationwide is they can go on clinicaltrials.gov.
Yep.
So they can definitely go on clinicaltrials.gov. Not the easiest process, but you can pretty much get a little bit of information about that. And if there's a specific organization, a specific pharmaceutical company or biotech that is working within that indication, I would say most pharma companies have a website that you can go on and put in clinical trials. And you can even just Google clinical trials for whatever disease or illness that you have. And you can pretty much find a lot of people are utilizing social media. A lot of patient advocacy organizations now have information about the different clinical trials that are going on as well. You can ask your physician, but I'm just being very honest and transparent because I work with tons and tons of physicians in community hospitals. They just don't have the resources to know all of the different clinical trials for every single type of illness that you have. But what you can do, when you do find something, you can definitely then talk about it with them and let them be an avenue. Or when you work with that physician, when you do a clinical trial and you say, I go meet with Dr. Mark, I was like, Mark, I would like to have you talk to my healthcare provider. Is that okay? And I'm sure, Mark, when you were an investigator, you have no problem talking to someone's actual primary care physician. That
Wait,
they've been going
he
to
doesn't
for
do
20
that now?
years.
He won't
No,
go
I know,
and
but
talk.
I'm just saying.
I'll do whatever I'm allowed to do. I just often don't
But
know
I'm
what
saying,
those
I was
rules
using
are.
that as an example that as an investigator,
Yeah.
physicians do not have that problem talking to your primary care physician. That's important for them to know. So that way you can bring in your community when you're going into that
That's
visit.
good to know, though. I didn't know investigators would talk to the physicians because
They
I
will.
don't think a lot
yeah.
of people know that.
Yes,
Sure, yep.
they will.
Yep.
That's a really good point.
Yep.
But I think increasingly as patient advocacy groups become larger and more well known,
Yes.
I think that's going to be maybe the easiest way for a patient to find information where they can understand it when they're reading it
Yes.
and feel like they're also in a supportive environment,
Yes.
that they're being loved, and
Yes.
the information is for their well-being and not trying to sell a product. And I think that's going to
Yes.
be a great way for
Yes.
people, in the future to really find out.
Neutral.
No,
Yeah.
for sure. But I really love that investigator talking to the physician
Yeah.
and the organizations because people find a lot of value getting information in spaces that they really trust and they feel supported.
I agree. Because if they find a trial online, it is the right thing to do. You should talk to your physician's been seeing you for 20, 30
Yes.
years. Why would you not go to that physician and say, hey, I'm considering this, I mean, I can't think of any, but I've met with, in 37 years, I cannot see a physician that's doing a clinical trial that would not talk to your healthcare provider. Now, there will be some things that person will not be able to disclose, but everything that's in that informed consent that patient signed, that physician can discuss, because that patient, that's why it's an informed consent, so that you can be informed. And that's why the informed consent process is not about you taking the document and reading. They'll tell you, take it home, discuss it with your family, discuss it with your physician. They want you to do that because they want to make sure that you're truly informed about what you're doing, why you're doing, and what's the outcome.
Right.
So that's processes, and it has to be documented. So doctors have to document that informed consent process. That's the regulators look for that.
Oh yeah.
Look, Karen gave the face. They look for that. That means if you do not have that document,
It ain't happening.
your boot is grass.
Right. Well, it's just not going to happen. You can't enroll without consent. So
can't enroll without consent.
Yeah.
I love it. We've talked about so many things. I actually had so many more questions and other topics, especially on building out the trials and data analysis and where do you do with my information? So we're probably gonna have to have you all come back because this was really good.
I like a part 2.
Yeah, I do too. I do too.
Part
Like, we
two.
were good. This is good. But we've come to the point in the show where you all have to drop that deuce. And that means that you have to share 2 takeaways that you'd like to leave the audience with. Remember, we are patient friendly, focus on patients. So you have to leave them with 2 things you want them to keep in mind. I'm gonna go with Karen.
Okay. So 2 things that that's just dear to my heart is words opportunity and empowerment.
Yes.
And what I mean by opportunity is that each and every one of us have the opportunity to be a part of this process. If it's being a patient, if it's, looking at it from a career standpoint, if it's looking at it to share with other people, we all have the opportunity to be a part of this process because that's what we saw with COVID.
Yes.
That is what we saw. When everybody came together in this world, that's how we was able to combat it. So that's how I feel about clinical research and clinical trials. Because I want to see a day without disease. That's what we're all looking for on this side of the industry.
Yes.
And then empowerment. You are empowered to get information. You are empowered as a patient. You have the power to make a difference. So that's the second word, but empowerment and opportunity.
Love it.
I would say that, we're all different, and science is really our key to trying to understand how we're different in a way that can matter as far as developing medicine and coming up with new therapies that work for different people and that work better than what we have. I always like to do not just another thing, but something even better than what we have. And I would say the second thing is that research is just, it's vitally important for us being able to answer those questions. And clinical research is really, it is an opportunity for patients to, learn more about themselves and people like them and about people not like them and about what might work best. So, yeah.
Thank you.
And then Coachy's awesome.
Yeah, Coach is awesome. Definitely.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank my awesome guests. This has been a wonderful episode on Respect the Technique. Remember, in order for us to have medicine has to have research, and research has to have you. We hope to see you again. Until then, thank you for tuning in.
Running through it with the young influence, adolescent presence, I'm succumbing to it. I've been giving yeses when I shouldn't do it. I complete ejected, but the moves elusive, and I'm barely moving, but I'm still gon' boost them. I can't work on winnings when I know you're losing, so I with the winnings and they throw the deuces. Guess I have to pivot, shooting no bazookas for the